Lookup and reference functions. Round one. There's going to be 3 rounds. The lookup and reference functions are invaluable when you're trying to compile information from various worksheets or even workbooks. We're going to begin with the indirect function, which allows you to reference a text string that will define the argument required for a given function. And then we'll look at the address function, which will provide the address to a cell that's referenced, and the column and row function, which will provide the column or row number for the cell that's referenced. The choose function allows you to choose from a list of alternatives that are actually embedded within the choose function itself. And the hyperlink function allows you to build a hyperlink by concatenating text strings together. So the indirect reference function. The indirect reference function can be really useful at times to build some flexibility and build some dynamic references within your formulas and functions. We're going to walk through 4 examples of the indirect reference function, focusing on, at first, the brown colored filled cells in column E labeled text string. So what is the indirect reference function? The indirect reference function allows you to, instead of defining an argument or hard-coding an argument, you can use the indirect reference function to refer to a cell, a range on another worksheet that's external to the function that you're building by referencing another cell containing that text value that stands in for the value of the argument. If that didn't make sense, it will in a second. I'm going to put an indirect reference function in cell C11, equal IND, arrowing down, tabbing. The argument, the required argument for the indirect reference function is the referenced text. And I don't have any reference text in this cell yet, but I'm going to put some there, cell E11. And then the optional argument allows you to select which style of reference that you're going to use, either the R1C1 style or the default style, which is the A1 style. I'm going to leave it at the default style, Control Enter. And of course I get an error because there is no text string in E11. But I'm going to put one there. I'm going to put a cell reference, G11, Enter. And now what's happened? The indirect reference is referencing the value that's in cell G11 by referencing a cell that references that cell that is the text string that's contained in cell E11, says G11, and then it pulls the value 10, the number 10, into cell C11 that contains the indirect reference, F2. So the indirect reference is referencing cell E11, which has the text string G11. That text string stands in for the argument value for this indirect reference, which is just a cell reference that contains a value of 10. I'm going to escape out of that. And I'm going to select these 3 cells and in the name box define a named range. I'm going to define it to be example, enter, and now I'm going to use a sum function, tab that into the cell. So instead of defining the argument by inputting a number or referencing a cell or referencing a range, I'm going to use the indirect reference to define the argument. Tabbing that into the cell, and the reference text is going to be, again, a cell outside of the cell I'm building the function in, cell E13, closing the parentheses and entering. Of course, it's going to give me an error because there is no range defined in cell E13, but I want to put the name of the range that we just created, and now I get the result, which is the sum of the range example. And so we've used the indirect reference to reference the value that's in cell E13, which is the name of the range that we created, and that range is actually cells G13 to I13. So this time, I'm going to set up the text string before I create the indirect reference. And in order to do this, I'm going to use the AutoSum function and go to Sheet 2 and select all the values in that range and then enter. So of course I get a sum of all the values, but what I'm really after is the text string that was created by the sum function. I'm going to backspace to remove that parentheses and backspace to remove that parentheses and the sum function name, and then enter. And I have a text string that references sheet 2 and a range F28 to H33. So can I use an indirect reference to reference that text string as a stand-in for an argument for, let's say, a sum function? Well, I can. The sum function goes into the cell, followed by the indirect reference, tabbing that, referring to the text string that's in cell E15, and closing the parentheses, both of them, and entering. I get the value we just saw when I summed the range on sheet 2. So what's the takeaway for this particular part 3 of these examples that we're running through? This means that you can dynamically reference a different worksheet and feed your formulas and your functions dynamically. Your references don't have to be hard-coded. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to build a VLOOKUP and use an indirect reference for the range that we're going to look into. First, I'm going to copy the range that we created and paste the value. And that's not exactly the range we need to do a VLOOKUP, because I need to include at least column E, because that has the value that we're going to be looking up, the product number. So I'm going to F2 to get to the edit mode, backspace over F, and replace that with E, and enter. And then I also want the same reference for the worksheet that we're on. And because of the object-oriented nature of the way Excel thinks and processes information, I really don't need the sheet reference that we're currently on. I can get rid of all of that and just use that as a reference for my VLOOKUP. Although if I did include the sheet name indirect, it would work the same way. So now I can build my VLOOKUP. And what I want to look up is product 1. And the table array, I'm going to define using an indirect reference, tabbing that into the cell. And the first indirect reference, or the text string that contains the reference that we want to use for this VLOOKUP, is in cell E21, closing the parentheses, comma, to moving on to the column index number, which will make, let's say, 3, which will give us the amount for February. Closing the parentheses and enter, I get 1,195. Because the values on sheet 2 are the same values on the indirect sheet plus 1,000. And there it is. We're looking at product 1 going to the third column in that range, and the VLOOKUP function returns the value 1,195. Well, now, all I have to do to refer to another worksheet is to copy this VLOOKUP down and enter. And now the VLOOKUP, this new VLOOKUP, is referring to the text string or the value that's in cell E22 that's being referenced by the indirect reference, which will then pull that text string in to stand in as the definition of the argument of the range that the VLOOKUP is looking into. So once you get comfortable with these indirect reference functions, they can provide a whole new way to build some dynamic references in your functions and formulas. So the address, column, and row functions. The address function allows you to build a cell address in its complete form. Again, this can be used to build some dynamic references in your functions and formulas. So it has a lot of arguments, but they all make sense as to why they're there. Equal ADD RE, well, that's enough. I'm going to tab it into the cell. I'm going to input row number 10, comma, column number 10, comma. Now we get the option, this is an optional argument, to select whether this is going to be an absolute reference or a mixed reference or a relative reference. I'm going to make it an absolute reference by choosing 1, comma, and then I get the optional argument that I can define either to use the R1, C1 style of referencing a cell or the A1 style. I'm going to choose the A1 style because that's what most people are used to, comma. And then the sheet text is going to be the sheet reference if it's something other than the current worksheet, which you can obviously also input the current worksheet. I'm going to input sheet 2 and then enter, and I get a cell reference. Sheet 2, cell J10. Going to sheet 2, cell J10. I want to put a value in there. and then going back to our address function, and combining this with what we just covered, the indirect reference function, we can use the indirect reference, of course, to reference the text that's in cell B16, which is the address that we built using the address function, and entering, and I get the value that we just put into cell J10. So going back to the worksheet, the column function will return the column number for the reference. So column I, enter, is column 9. I use the column function in the VLOOKUP movie to make the column reference argument in the VLOOKUP dynamic. Because since, in this case, the column reference is referencing cell I-23, if I input any columns in between column A and column I, I'll put in 2, the column reference is now 11 because column I has now moved over and has become column K. So again, this is a way to build some dynamic references in your functions and formulas, allowing you to insert rows and columns, where by doing that, you won't lose the column reference or the row reference that you originally intended to reference when you were building your functions and formulas. And the row reference works exactly the same way, only it's a row number. I'm going to select row 30, and when we input a couple of rows in between the first row and row 30, that now becomes row 32. The choose function. We're going to build a choose function. In fact, we're going to build 2 of them. Tabbing that into the cell. The index number, I'm going to hard code for the time being. I'm going to make it 1, comma, and then the values, which are going to be separated by a comma, are going to be the values that I've set up for a calendar-based year, where quarter 1 is January, February, and March, and quarter 2 is April, May, June, and so on, comma, and I'm going to just select these quickly and define all of these quarters to be the value for the number, the index number, that is embedded and hard-coded at this point in the choose function. Currently that value is 1. So when I enter, I get quarter 1. Now we can also make the reference dynamic. If I put 6 and go back and change that hard-coded reference to cell B9, and I also want to make that an absolute reference by pressing F4, 6 is in quarter 2. It's June. 10, of course, is in quarter 4. And if you should be on a fiscal year, copying this down 2 rows so that I reference that range of cells, 10 or October is actually, in this fictitious fiscal year, the 3rd quarter. So the choose function can actually be used in conjunction with other functions to allow a user of a spreadsheet to dynamically change the references for maybe some data that's feeding a chart or that's feeding a schedule. So the hyperlink function. The hyperlink function allows you to string together text strings that build for you the URL or the internet address of a web page. So below, I have the internet address that I copied from my browser that was displayed when I got the quotes for 2 companies, DE, which is John Deere, and WMT, which is the ticker symbol for Walmart. And the thing about these 2 text strings is they are exactly the same, except for the ticker symbol that's referenced towards the end of the URL is of course different. The first one is DE, the second one is WMT. But the rest of the text in the internet address is exactly the same. So I'm going to copy the first text string into 2 different cells and select the first one, press F2, and I want to get rid of the ticker symbol and then everything after that, because I want the text string that is all of the text that comes before the ticker symbol. Pressing the Home tab and then inserting a quote mark to make sure that Excel understands that this is a text string, because otherwise it'll treat it like a hyperlink, and then enter. And then the other part of the text string that I need is everything after the ticker symbol. So I'm going to get rid of everything before that and enter. And now I have the text strings that I need that I can concatenate together to build a valid internet address that will return to me the current stock price of John Deere and Walmart. And this is where the hyperlink function comes in. So I'm going to put a hyperlink function into cell D16, tab. The link location is the internet address. That is the first part of the valid internet address that I need. And I'm going to concatenate these together by using an ampersand. You can use the concatenate function if you want to. The next part of the internet address is the ticker symbol. And then the last part of the internet address is what comes after the ticker symbol. And I'm going to make cell D13 an absolute reference and make cell D12 an absolute reference as well. Press the N key to get to the end of the definition of the arguments, and comma, where I have the option to put in a friendly name, is what it's called. And I'm going to name this stock quote. And then enter. And stock quote is the text that's displayed for the hyperlink. And of course, Excel formats this as a hyperlink, the default formatting, which is blue and underlined. And when I hover over this hyperlink, I get the URL address, and my cursor turns into the little hand. And when I left click that hyperlink, I'm taken to a web page that shows me the current price of John Deere. I'm going to close that and copy my hyperlink down so that now I should be able to find the current price of Walmart. And since I have already visited the web page for the John Deere stock price, the default formatting for a visited hyperlink is to make it purple. Clicking on the Walmart quote, I should be able to get the current price for Walmart. So those are some fairly valuable lookup and reference functions. The indirect reference function allows you to reference a cell that contains a text string that stands in as the value for the argument of the function that you're building. The address function allows you to dynamically build a cell address. The column and row function will return the column number or the row number to a reference cell. The choose function will take an index number and return to you the corresponding value for the choose argument that is either hard-coded or that references another cell. And the hyperlink function allows you to take text strings and concatenate them together to build a valid internet address that then functions as a hyperlink.